Metroid 2 Return of Samus was a really strange yet important entry in the series, with it planting the seeds of the legendary plot of the sequel while also creating some staples in the series when it comes to visuals and some of the upgrades introduced in this game. Much like its predecessor though, this game did not age very well, with its limitations from the original Game Boy hardware really showing some cracks, and with some level design generally just being more linear and disjointed to accommodate for the handheld playstyle. The game was really due for a remake. This didn't officially happen for a couple of decades though, and so with time, the fans took it into their own hands, and eventually thanks to the resilience of indie game developer Dr. M64 after almost a whole decade of development, they came through with the masterfully designed AM2R, also known as another Metroid 2 remake. This remake was almost universally praised by fans of the Metroid franchise for its great integration of elements from some of the best games in the series that made the original Metroid 2 experience feel a lot more interesting. But nothing ever lasts forever, and this is when the stalker fiend Nintendo ninjas attacked and took down the fan gang for seemingly no reason. This is when suddenly, at the 2017 Nintendo Treehouse E3 showcase, Nintendo suddenly revealed their own remake of Metroid 2, introducing brand new mechanics with hopes of pushing the series forward, which was later released that same year. Here we are a couple of years later, with the developers of this game using what mechanics they introduced here in the brand new entry Metroid Dread. Nintendo must have really seen something here in Samus Returns that pushed producer Yoshio Sakamoto to continue the Metroid franchise. What worked and didn't work in this game, and was this the return to form the franchise needed after a near decade of silence and bad choices? Let's find out. I am Sleep, and welcome to Metroid Samus Returns. Metroid Samus Returns opens up with this beautifully illustrated recap of the events of Zero Mission, re-establishing the character of Samus and her position in the Metroid timeline. The game establishes her mission of going to the Metroid's homeworld to eliminate the Metroids after the Galactic Federation went on their own mission to investigate and learn about the Metroids, with it going about as wrong as you would expect. This intro segment does a really good job of establishing the tone of the Metroid series, along with catching up newer fans to the world of this game, since this was a big return to form for the Metroid franchise after nearly a decade of dormancy. But how does the gameplay stack up in this aspect? Samus Returns actually really excels in introducing mechanics to the player in the first introductory area. It for the most part is a complete rip from the original Metroid 2 intro, but adds in things like the wall jumping and a missile tutorial that feels natural and fantastically designed. I think in general, the game does this well when it comes to giving you upgrades and integrating the mechanics from these upgrades in later segments of the game. One really consistent mechanic the game really wants you to learn to use is the counter move Samus Returns introduces early into the game. This move can parry and stun enemies if timed on the subtle flash of their attacks. This counter flash is basically on most of the attacks enemies throw out in this game, and the entire game is bounced around this move in a way that if you don't have it mastered by the end of this journey, you'll get absolutely decimated by whiffed counters. There are so many bosses that even force you to land this move to progress further into their respective fights too, and honestly, I think it gives a good difficulty curve to the overall game. This move has been somewhat divisive within the Metroid fanbase though, with a lot of people having issue with the momentum stopping properties of the move, and I think the game developers are taking those criticisms into consideration from what they've shown off in Dread. Speaking of new mechanics for this game, I haven't gotten to mention the brand new Aeon abilities. There's this gauge that fills up throughout the game after defeating enemies that gives you access to several abilities gained in a similar manner to how you find traditional power-ups. There are a total of 4 Aeon abilities you can find that are actually really helpful in combat and general exploration. The first ability of the 4 is probably the most useful to me as someone who loves completing these games, the Scan Pulse. This move is a giant pulse that outlines breakable blocks in your general area and loads in a fair bit of unexplored map segments, which is extremely helpful for finding upgrades and secrets. I've heard some fans complain about this removing the exploration factor, oomph of finding a missile expansion, but honestly, I think the game tackles this specific mechanic in a way that makes it easier for newer fans to get into the series so they don't get stuck in certain moments, and it's done in a way that doesn't force the player to use the move, so that if you want that traditional Metroid secret hunting experience, you can do so. The second Aeon ability is the Lightning Armor. This one is a little less useful in the overall scheme of the game. Essentially, the main gimmick of this ability is that it's a shield that slowly drains your Aeon gauge with it tanking damage without harming your health. It's a more puzzle-based upgrade, mainly used for these poisonous plant areas that do a fuck ton of damage without the ability's protection. There's also significantly increased range on your counter move that the game doesn't really highlight well, that I think if brought back in future games could really make this ability a lot more consistently useful. The third ability is the immensely powerful Beam Burst. This ability gives you basically a rapid fire and very strong beam, with the Aeon Gauge kind of working as ammo. Its puzzle use is for destroying these little eggs that block some morph ball paths, as well as removing these giant plants that block progression. I think this upgrade is actually really overpowered when used by the right players in the right scenario. Certain bosses just get absolutely fucked by this beam and makes some fights just way too easy. I think it's well balanced in harder difficulties though, and becomes kind of essential during a certain fight we'll cover later. The fourth and final Aeon ability, the Phase Drift, is probably the least useful as it just slows down time for a small window, which is only really helpful during certain puzzle situations. I wish this specific one was integrated into a boss fight or two, but hey, it works for what it needs to when it comes to exploring this vast and expanding environment. Speaking of the environment, let's talk about this game's level design. The original Metroid 2 is this very cramped and compact game due to a lot of limitations from the original Game Boy's hardware. The game took advantage of this lowering lava progression system when it came to advancing further into the depths of SR388, which worked pretty well for the more sectioned up handheld approach to a game on an older portable system. Samus Returns maintains this for the most part, but expands on more open areas of the original, which integrate more puzzle and depth to the exploration from more modern Metroid games, and it works fantastically. There are plenty of areas in this game which feel unique and lush and distinct in a way that you won't get lost, which is a huge upgrade from the black and white Game Boy game. The presentation of these areas might be some of the best visuals on the 3DS, with sprawling backgrounds and unique enemies to boot. There's so much going on in the background to take in, with some awesome creatures and environmental art that just gives you that motivation to explore. Puzzles are so varied and unique too. Like, some of these missile expansions in this game take a lot to just get to, and they feel like compact mini puzzles that just feel satisfying as hell to complete. It's some of the slickest game design in the series too, and is up there with some of the greats like Zero Mission. It's the return to form Metroid fans were begging for, and was definitely up to snuff as a quality remake of an older Metroid game in this aspect. I actually really like the environmental storytelling and the use of level design in the boss fights in this game. The original Metroid 2 has a really bad problem with it feeling repetitive in terms of boss fights, since you are essentially just looking to exterminate different forms of Metroids. Samus Returns really needed to make this Metroid hunting format work in a way that felt interesting and challenging every time you ran into one of these things, and it does a pretty damn good job at that. Your environments and the progressively stronger and expanding movesets of these Metroids makes encounters feel interesting and sometimes absolutely kick your ass. One of my favorite examples of this in the game is the specific encounter with an Alpha 4 Metroid you have to fight in the water without a gravity suit, which could really leave a dent on you with how much these things charge at you. The darker, more blacker variations of the individual Metroid fights almost always felt like a good challenge, and really test your familiarity with the movesets of these things. My only gripe with the environment's involvement in the Metroid fights is the Gamma Metroids. This form of Metroid likes to run away after a set amount of hits, and kind of forces you to scramble and explore the surrounding area of where you previously fought it in a way that kind of halts the action and takes away from the tension. I also don't really like how intrusive pressing the grapple beam button on the touchscreen feels in the Zeta Metroid fights. It kind of felt like an unneeded step that took away my attention from the game and brought them to the controls. Besides that though, I think the progressively evolving Metroid forms give unique and fun movesets that make the difficulty curve feel more natural. The fights specifically with the Omega Metroids really stuck with me as fun, tense, and climactic fights that pushed me as a player to get prepared for the later game areas. The non-Metroid boss fights in this game are pretty great too, with the Arachnus fight being a fun expansion of the one both in the original Metroid 2 and the one in Fusion. The big standout non-Metroid boss fight in this game though is the one with the Diggernaut robot. It has this great build up through the game where you wake it up to clear a path, have a fun escape scene, and then eventually face it. The fight itself is multi-stage and really tests your use of a lot of the tools the game throws your way up to this point. The fight will have you bombing and spireballing into its drills, laying into its face, and avoiding lasers in a fun and thrilling fight. It's a really fantastic highlight in this game. The last area of SR388 is probably my favorite in the entire game. The beginning of this map is jam-packed with puzzles and upgrades, and it feels like this lead up for the finale. Once you delve deep into this area, you find yourself within the Metroid's nest, where your Metroid counter just goes through the roof and you have to fight these newly hatched Metroids, similarly to the build up to the Mother Brain fight in Zero Mission. The payoff for getting to the end of this area in this game being the fantastic boss fight against the Queen Metroid. She's absolutely menacing and has so many new moves that make this fight an absolute test of how well you can use your tools, as well as a general skill check. She has so many cool ass moves, like her laser breath beam that leaves this trail of fire she tries to push you into with her menacing charge and swing moves. laying hits in there feels absolutely satisfying and truly like a huge finale to the journey thus far. You beat her by lowering her health down until she tries to bite you, where you hit her with a counter attack and you just stun her enough for you to pull her down with a grapple beam and a roll into her stomach to powerbomb the bitch. It's fucking amazing. Defeating her leaves you with a single Metroid left on the counter, where the famous encounter with the baby Metroid happens. Samus contemplates killing this Metroid for a bit, but after realizing that the baby isn't acting hostile due to it thinking that Samus is her mother, she decides to take it with her. The baby in Samus Returns serves as his final upgrade that eats these crystals and opens up a lot of puzzles if you backtrack and go for completion. Speaking of completion in this game, it's actually really easy too, with the fantastic transportation station system in this game that makes backtracking an absolute blast to do, making this probably one of the easiest and most fun games to get 100% save on. The reward in this game for completion is pretty cool too, as it gives you some backstory to the Chozo and their relationship with SR388, along with establishing some threats that will appear in Metroid Fusion and Dread. Back to the main game though, once you get the baby Metroid, you make your way back up to the surface of SR388 through an area you couldn't access previously. The baby Metroid and Samus then attempt to head back to Samus's gunship, where the two are suddenly ambushed by Ridley in a brand new fight. This fight is a pretty standard Ridley fight that actually makes the Metroid Prime trilogy canon again thanks to the robotic design of Ridley. The fight for the most part is just you absolutely plummeting him with shots from the beam burst, along with him going down really easily if you collected all the Aeon expansions. After this, the game ends in traditional Metroid fashion, with Samus taking off her suit and showing off your completion score in time. It's a pretty fitting finale and shows off some prior motivation to Ridley's kidnapping of the baby Metroid in Super Metroid, but we'll talk about that game next. Overall, Metroid Samus Returns is an absolute treat for Metroid fans, and works as a great return to form for the 2D Metroid series, with it taking risk and innovating the series mechanically in fantastic ways. It's easily my favorite version of Metroid 2, and it ranks pretty high for me in the overall series. I'm really excited to see the series back thanks to this game, and I hope to see the upcoming Metroid Dread improve upon the mechanics established in this game. But for now, we'll just have to wait and see how that turns out. Thank you guys for dropping on by for this review. I am Sleep, and I hope to see you guys next time. Goodbye!